What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Ami's House. This is Ami's House Live. We are going to be just discussing some of the recent developments happening online, and I'm currently traveling right now. So I am actually in Los Angeles, as you can tell, in a remote studio set up here, and wanted to stay consistent week by week to continue to connect with all of you and give you my takes and feedback on what's been going on out there. So, a couple of things have happened since last week. We had Nick Fuentes appear on Piers Morgan. We're going to talk about that. And then, even as recently as today, we're going to see the continued, witnessing the continued derangement of Candace Owens as that sort of the boundaries that she's increasingly willing to cross that are, one would think, are beyond the pale, are now being crossed as she turns and sets her sights on Erika Kirk herself, which we all knew this was coming. So I want to say on the outset that some of the things I spoke about last week that I want to reiterate today is you have good, you have evil, and then you have courage. We have a lot of evil. We have people that are good, but it takes courage to stand up and call these people out. Some people sat on the fence for a while. Some people are still sitting on the fence. I've been recently seeing Tim Pool has been going fully scorched earth on Candace Owens. While at first, he was one of the people who was a little bit kind of watching from the sidelines, sort of trying to ignore it. But I think realizing who the people are that are actually causing this disunity, this distraction, politically, culturally, where in the aftermath of the tragedy and death of Charlie Kirk, what are we talking about? Are we talking about left-wing violence? Are we talking about people who want to suppress speech with violence? No. We're talking about Israel. We're talking about the Jews. We're talking about Turning Point USA as being culpable, as being the bad guys somehow involved. We're talking about Candace Owens. We're talking about Tucker. These are the people who have monopolized the attention, the message, the battle, and created an infighting that continues. And it's a massive distraction. And it also just paves the way come 2026, 2028 for mass left-wing takeover of our politics. All they have to do is point to the right wing and say what they once used to say that was false. They could point to the right and say, look, there's Nazis everywhere over there and conspiracy theorists and crazy people. And you know what? They'd be right. They would be correct because so many people on the, quote, conservative side are giving them the caricature that they once called the right. They're giving the left on a silver platter everything that the left wanted to portray the right as. They are just manifesting and acting out as, making room for this stuff and this nonsense and not properly having the courage to call it out. Now, I will say the worst ideas of the left overall over the last decade were embraced by their mainstream, and it led to their downfall. As I mentioned from being at the PragerU Gala last week, there are plenty of people on the right who are courageous enough to call this out unequivocally and reject it. From Douglas Murray, we've seen what he said, to Seth Dillon, James Lindsay, Ben Shapiro. These are the real ones. They're willing to call this out and confront it unequivocally and not make apologies for it, not try to evade it, but confront it. As I've been getting more and more into this space, you just see things you can't unsee. I've seen private text messages and exchanges between people that have revealed who the real ones are and who the fraudsters are, who are making waves and who are riding waves, who are trying to assess where the culture is going and don't want to lose their audience. God forbid you should lose your audience, so you try to pander to them, placate them, versus the ones who are willing to piss off their audience because they have integrity and consistency. You do no favors to your audience by trying to put on kid gloves and not upset them. The best service you can do to your audience is continue to be honest with them about your feelings, even if it may upset them, because it's your honesty and your integrity that in the long haul will maintain that audience over time. The standard is telling the truth and being courageous in the face of toxic, disgusting, bad ideas that will destroy an entire movement. You have to root that out. And in the short term, you might have some losses, but in the long term, you'll have gains. And quite the contrary, for the Tucker Carlsons and the Candace Owens of the world, for their short-term gains, they're going to have long-term losses. I'm certain of it. Because if you don't operate from integrity and honesty, you'll lose in the long run. I think of this little story because, someone like Joe Rogan, for example, I think this is a story that would connect with him. People are pointing to the fact that, oh my God, but Candace is unstoppable. She has this #1 podcast. Her numbers are through the roof. What are we going to do about this? How's it? And I reassure people. I say, look, there was a time when Joe Rogan was a no-name comedian, didn't have a huge following or an audience, and he went up against one of the biggest comedians in the world at the time. His name was Carlos Mencia. Why did he go up against him? Why did he confront him? Because Carlos Mencia was stealing material, and everybody knew it. But no one could stop Carlos Mencia, who was a dishonest, bad faith actor in the game. He was stealing everyone's material. Everybody knew it, and no one had the balls to go up against him because he had the audience. But what did Joe Rogan do? Joe Rogan called him out, and he took hits for it. Got banned from the Comedy Store. He confronted him on stage and called him a thief. And he went up against the giant in the entertainment space who seemed unstoppable. Now I ask you, where's Carlos Mencia now? And where is Joe Rogan now? I think watching Candace's conduct and behavior over the last 2 years, and increasingly over the last few months since Charlie's death, she's just going to increasingly isolate herself. And she will be alone on a rock in the Red Sea with the empire fallen. That's what happened to Pharaoh. Remember the Bible. Remember the Bible. Remember the story. Channeling my inner Candace now. But remember those biblical narratives and stories. They are timeless and true. Pharaoh, the biggest empire, unstoppable, indestructible. And what happened? Alone on a rock in the Red Sea. And he was left there to witness the empire collapse. And I think the house of cards is going to start to crumble. I think Candace's whole narrative is built on a house of cards that will crumble. Tucker pretending he doesn't know certain people, pretending he doesn't know what anything is. You watch a show, he's like, I don't know that. This is a bed. This is a bed. What is a bed? What is that? I know you're supposed to sleep on it, but I was molested by a demon in my sleep, so I don't sleep anymore. What is a bed? What that is exactly? I don't know what that means. Is there a cloud in the sky? What's a cloud? Why is it white? Is that not something to be proud of? If it's white, there's nothing wrong with a white cloud. I know rain clouds are darker, but is that a racial thing? Like, just that whole game of pretending not to know what anything is. I love guitar. I'm an American. First of all, I'm an American. I can do what I want. Giving all these Christian Zionists all this crap for being supportive of Israel. People crap for wanting to live in Israel or buy property in Israel. And what does Tucker just announce? That he bought property in Doha, Qatar. Irony. These people reveal themselves. And look at Candace. Look what's happening this week as she turns on Erika Kirk. My first thought is, wait a minute. Before we get to you actually going after the widow of Charlie Kirk, targeting her, before we move the goalpost there to this level of despicable behavior, what happened to the French legions, the legionnaires, the French government trying to assassinate you? Guys, this is the MO. This is the continued conduct and behavioral pattern. This is what keeps happening. Crazy, insane Hail Mary pass story to monopolize attention in one direction as she faces a defamation lawsuit, which I think is pretty intense and pretty severe and pretty damning. Let's throw this Hail Mary pass up of distraction and we all just move on. Nothing materializes. No evidence comes up. Nothing validates her story or narrative. She goes out to holiday parties out in public whilst claiming there's an assassination attempt against her because somebody high up, somebody sent me a text, okay? And then what happens? We distract from one insane narrative by replacing it with another insane claim, targeting Erika Kirk. The next thing, and as you see, it's like what Jordan Peterson used to say, things get bad one small step at a time, it's like incremental. You put a frog in boiling water, it jumps right out, but you put a frog in regular water and gradually turn the temperature up, it won't know what's going on, and eventually the frog will die, but it won't know that the water's increasingly boiling. It's the same thing with these increased insane narratives that are more and more absurd and more without evidence, more and more revealed to be lies. But we just move on from one to the next and reset the clock as if we're all supposed to just forget these ridiculous claims. But what Candace doesn't realize that she's doing is she's surrounding herself with a minefield of her own false statements, of her own manipulations. And to use a Jordan Peterson Disney analogy, it's like what happened to, Scar at the end of Lion King, right? He looks at the hyenas that he thought were his allies and he goes, my friends. And they say, friends? I thought you said we were the enemy. Because Scar surrounded himself with minds. When he was talking to one person, he said one thing. When he was talking to other people, he was saying another thing. And forgive the Disney analogy, but I think it makes a lot of sense because Disney was really good back in the day. I mean, these villains were really good villains. These stories were really good stories. But it led to his demise. And I think that in Candace's case, as she surrounds herself with her own falsehoods, by her own making, it will facilitate her own undoing. And she will just keep losing audience, losing relevance. It'll be one of those stories. God, remember that crazy deranged woman that eventually led to her own obscurity? It's because you can't keep doing this consistently. You'll cannibalize your own audience. Nick Fuentes' audience has turned on Candace. More and more people who were trying to get on board the sensationalist train of the narratives that she was peddling, more and more people are starting to say, I got to get off. I got to get off this train because it's heading to the edge of a cliff over here. And that's what we're seeing. And that is what we're seeing. It's very obvious. I've been saying it for a long time. Thought there was hope at one point, obviously, but as demonstrated by this conduct, not ideas, conduct, lying, making up narratives, insinuating, all insinuation, manipulation, never actually saying the thing, leaving just enough room to try to wiggle out of it. This is a pattern now. If you do the same thing too many times, we are pattern recognizing creatures, pattern recognition, and we see it. And more people, I think, see it. And so let's see what happens as as she turns her ire towards Erika Kirk, the widow of Charlie, which at one point we all know that would have been way too far. That would have been immediately disqualifying. But you didn't do that right away. We're up to that point. So be aware of the incrementalism of what I would call acceptable behavior. You can't go right for the worst thing you could do, but as you keep pushing and pushing and pushing, people now are, and the audience that stays with her are just becoming increasingly deranged, increasingly evil, increasingly just despicable. Like these are boundaries and lines and just conduct that we should all condemn unequivocally, not take seriously. I think this is fundamentally driven by audience provocation, not truth, but what gets a reaction. You keep doing that over time, eventually you're sacrificing the most important things, mainly credibility and integrity. You can learn a lot about people by the relationships they keep over time. You can learn a lot about people by the relationships they lose over time. And in Candace's case, that's everybody. Everybody. From Dave Rubin to Prager to Daily Wire, increasingly isolated. And it's self-induced. What a shame. What a shame. Moving on, Nick Fuentes appears on Piers Morgan. He makes an appearance on Piers Morgan. Now, I'm actually kind of conflicted about this because I am not of the belief that you could just be a baby boomer about this stuff, that when you see these new cultural phenomenons, we just ignore them and we just kind of go back to our old ways and old habits and think the world is such and such way, and that these bad ideas that are on the rise, we could just kind of ignore them and not give it any attention or oxygen. I think you do have to address the Nick Fuentes phenomenon. You do have to talk about it. You do have to discuss it. But at the same time, that doesn't mean you have to invite a Nick Fuentes into the room for a nice, chummy, fun, kibitzy conversation. People are doing that, I think, and they're being a bit obtuse and ridiculous about it. I mean, look at what Steven Crowder had him on recently and was just like, so wait, let me get this straight. Like, just to ask you, lightning round. Are you an anti-Semite? Do you hate Jews? And he's like, no. Oh, well, that settles it. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Is that all it takes? Despite everything the man has ever said and done, and despite the audience he's built on the anti-Semitic ideas that he's built them on, none of that matters now because he says to you on one podcast, as he tries to mainstream himself, no. So yes, I think you have to address the phenomenon that is Nick Fuentes. I think you do it by addressing maybe the wrong ideas he's putting out there. I don't think you necessarily have to engage with him as a person to do that. Because what ends up happening most of the time, even under the guise of it's conversation, we have to be able to debate these ideas, even the worst ideas. What ends up happening when Nick Fuentes goes on all these podcasts is not that Nick Fuentes comes around to their ideas and ends up being swayed by more reasonable ideas, but rather the podcasters that have him on end up being swayed by Nick Fuentes and persuaded by him to say, oh, okay, I guess you're not so bad. Rather than Nick Fuentes looking at him internally and saying, I guess I was wrong about my ideas. They say, oh, I guess what you're saying is more in a context. It's humorous. It's palatable. And then the worst, most toxic, dangerous ideas, the hateful ideas, the anti-Semitic ideas, the racist ideas, the misogynistic ideas, the actual ones that he really does stand for, become more mainstreamed and palatable and acceptable. That's the effect that this whole podcast circuit having him on has, sanitizing Nick Fuentes, making him palatable, making him okay, pushing that Overton window incrementally. And that's how the worst ideas, actual racism, actual anti-Semitism, chauvinism, misogyny, the actual things, these actual ideas that he really does believe, not giving women equal rights, fighting the Jews, fighting Jewish power, serve these. And he said on his podcast, these people need to be executed. I mean, the second we take power, they need to be executed. That's not a joke. He means the things he says. In a way, the respect I have for Nick Fuentes is that he's an authentic anti-Semite. He's an authentic version of himself. Obviously, I think he's manipulative in that when he gets on these mainstream platforms, he presents like a mensch. He presents like an intellectual. That's a very different face. You should check out Coleman Hugh's piece on Nick Fuentes was the best I've seen. He really did an amazing analysis of the two Nick Fuenteses that are operating out there. The one that live streams on Rumble to his fans, and the one that goes out there on the mainstream podcast circuit and presents in a suit, looking nice and speaking properly. So check out Coleman Hugh's piece on that. That's the best analysis I've seen. So the question is, what do you do? Do you address this? Yes, you address the ideas and you focus on what's true and what's false, because we're not afraid of his ideas. We debunk them, but that doesn't mean you invite him in the room to be chummy. Now, that brings us to Piers Morgan and his approach to how he handled Nick Fuentes. You know, yes, he confronted him and called him out on certain things, but at the end of the day, I mean, he's interested in Nick Fuentes because Nick Fuentes is making an impact and garnering a lot of attention, and Piers Morgan feels compelled to cover that as his role as a journalist. Fine. He has to go to what's being culturally impactful and resonant, even if it's the worst ideas, and he says he wants to confront them. But it ended up having this dynamic of making Piers look like a boomer who's not in touch with online culture. And he's not really confronting him. He's more just lecturing him, having somebody on so he can tell him what a bad person he is. You don't really like women at all, do you? You're a really bad person, aren't you? You've never seen a tampon, have you? So I don't know how intellectually constructive something like that is, because there's two different manipulations going on. There's Piers taking the posture of looking virtuous and correct and enlightened, lecturing this younger generation who can always take the position of, you don't get us. You don't get my audience. You don't get my humor. You are out of touch. And so they just keep going cross purposes. And I don't feel like Piers is meeting Nick where Nick is on even the ideas, but more on just its casting aspersions and lecturing and telling Nick how evil he is. And I don't know. I don't know what the purpose of that is. Yes, he did a decent job, I think, of bringing receipts, but yeah, I'm conflicted about it. It was, in a way, more satisfying to watch than people who were just like, so like, yeah, you're racist, but I'm racist too. We're all a little anti-Semitic. Yeah. Now, I think there's a semantics game going on here where Nick says, he asked him, are you racist? He's like, yes, I'm racist. I think everyone's racist. That's a very, 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 I think, sneaky, tricky answer. It's an effective answer that Nick gave, because rather than being like, no, I'm not racist, he says, I am. We're all racist. Now, here's what's really tricky about a statement like that. What Nick is pointing to, in a way, like, Piers is not a perfect person. And so it's this weird way of saying, yeah, I'm racist, and so is everybody. Everyone's more like me than they'd like to believe. So who are you to judge? You're a little racist too. Now, on the humorous side of things, there's a show I saw on Broadway called Avenue Q. And they have a funny song called Everyone's a Little Bit Racist Sometimes. And in the context of humor, that's a very funny song. I really enjoyed it. Everyone's a little bit racist sometimes. Now, really what the song's about is not racism, but prejudice. Now, the concession I would make is that everyone's a little bit prejudiced. We all have preconceived notions about people. That's how humor about race and racial humor works, because of stereotypes and generalizations. And that's all well and good, because noticing patterns of culture and different kinds of people, communities that we come from. Yeah, we're not all just identical little robots of each other. Everyone's got unique features individually and collectively within communities. There are patterns and things, obviously. But that falls into the line of prejudice that I think everyone can admit to. Racist means something else. And this is a semantics trick that I think Nick Fuentes is playing on Piers and everybody watching. Because then everyone says, wait, am I racist because I notice differences or things like that? No, racism has a nefarious connotation, meaning you actually have not only like negative views towards minorities or other groups, but are okay wishing them harm, like evil intentions towards them, nefarious views, antagonistic views. It's not noticing differences between people or groups or religions or cultures. It comes with a flavor of evil intentions, of nefarious intentions. That's the kind of racism we, that normal, I think, common sense people refer to, and why they're not proud to wear a label that we're all racist when we may all have prejudices and preconceived notions. But racism is a different thing. And Nick is trying to just blend the two as if prejudice and racist are the same thing. And therefore, we can't judge Nick. He's free with shielded up from criticism because aren't we all a little bit racist? That's his whole defense. It's a kind of brilliant tactic. But don't be fooled by that tactic, that just because you yourself, can joke about race and notice different things in your own prejudice doesn't make you a racist. In a way, Nick is doing the exact same thing in reverse that the far left did when it came to the topic of race. So the far left used to say, if you notice anything different about races or make observations or use data to point to different things between particular groups that occur in reality, you're a racist. And you would say, no, I'm not. I'm a reasonable person. I may have some prejudice, but I'm looking at data and whatever. And Nick is doing the opposite. He's saying, if you notice any little differences on data points or anything like that, you're a racist, just like me. But Nick's racism is not the same as general population's prejudice. He's trying to equate the two to make him seem more palatable because he's just like you. But his views are far more nefarious than that. The things he's saying are not in a humorous way or in the context. It's in the context, if you add the context, as Coleman said in his piece, it makes his statements far worse. The things he'd actually like to see, that he'd actually like to see a Christian Catholic theocracy replace the U.S. government. This is the things that he said. I'm not taking him out of context. I'm not exaggerating. That the highest virtue, according to Nick Fuentes, is not freedom, it's order. That he would wish to impose on a society by force because he's a theocrat. His views about women, they are difficult to be around. I'm attracted to women, but he's trying to say how men should get married and have families, but he also says he's never, he's completely disinterested in women. He despises them. They're annoying to be around. He's never had sex. It was an irrelevant question by Piers, but whatever. The point being, he has a real hostility and animosity towards women and minorities and Jews and Jewish power that he talks about. And so don't be fooled. That's a manipulation. Don't be fooled to think, oh, I must be just like Nick too. He generalizes the accusations against and projects them onto everybody, and therefore he's immune from the criticism or the judgment. So don't be fooled by that tactic. I think the way to ultimately combat it is focus on what's true and what's false, not on what's hateful or not hateful, because hateful is something to me, Nick Fuentes is so obviously hateful, but even so, there's a denialism instinct that takes place amongst, whether it's Jews being attacked or anybody, that, he points to a discrepancy, a disparity. And he's like, well, Jewish power is what we need to fight. And my question is, well, why? Because Jews are overrepresented in certain areas of success in finance and business and Hollywood. We don't have to apologize for the overrepresentation. Where you're wrong, Nick, is in the means by which we achieve those things. Why Jews are prominent in these certain areas. Well, it's not rocket science, Nick. If you focus on scholarship, on academia, on raising strong nuclear families, you're going to get successful outcomes. So there's nothing to apologize for. There's nothing to hide behind. There's nothing guilty about Jewish accomplishment. And he uses words in a very tricky way, like control or power. Just because there's representation of Jews in Hollywood, that means we control Hollywood? What prevents you, Nick Fuentes, or any of your audience from doing the things you want to do? Accomplish things. No one's holding you back. There's no control. There's no politics involved. Are Jews overrepresented in politics in that way? Have there been Jewish presidents? He uses words that are politicized words that infer power and control as if it's a zero-sum game, as if success amongst the Jewish community somehow keeps out or keeps down other communities or white people. And that's just not true. That's just grievance culture and finding a scapegoat to blame for one's lack of success, is that it has to be because those Jews, so to speak, are successful. But that's a very anti-capitalistic view, anti-Western view. If we believe in personal responsibility, then you make good decisions for yourself and your family. That's a good antidote to anti-Semitism. If there's a choice between blaming others and blaming themselves, people seldom blame themselves. That's a Thomas Sowell quote. He was asked, the Thomas Sowell, the economist, what can Jews do to reduce the hostility towards them? And Thomas Sowell responds, fail. So we don't seek the approval, and we're not going to compromise on failing in order to be approved by those who hate us. That's not going to work. And so ultimately the anti-Semitism and the grievance culture and making yourself a victim, that's at their loss. That's at Nick Fuentes' loss. That's at his followers' loss, if that's the path they want to go down. It's not a very encouraging or inspiring message. I don't think it's a very effective message. And at the same time, you don't have to deny his observational claims about Jewish representation in areas of prominence. We can be proud of those things. We can be proud of the Nobel laureates and the contributions and the success, given that we've had to adapt under so many scenarios. There's this weird thing, though, that Nick Fuentes does where he actually has respect for the Jewish community in some way. Envy. It's very obvious. And so if he wants to choose to go down the path of envy, well, isn't that one of the 7 deadly sins according to his theology? So that's something he's got to work out within himself. It's not something Jews have to apologize for. But we don't have to deny it either, because there's nothing guilty about being successful, being proud, being prominent, and persevering through people who've tried to hurt us, put us down throughout history. Don't apologize or feel guilty for that success. Jewish success does not cause white failure. Just like on the left, they used to claim that minorities or African Americans, like their failures have to do with white people and blaming white people for their lack of success. Nick is doing the exact same thing. He's a leftist. He's doing the exact same leftist tactic of blaming systemic issues, the system, externalizing the problems of the lack of success in his community, so to speak. So that's how you kind of engage with the Nick Fuentes ideas, I think, without having to engage with Nick himself, because I do think he doesn't have good intentions. I think civil dialogue and discourse, I'm not saying Nick should be arrested or canceled or deplatformed. He can do what he wants to do. But there's a middle ground between completely ignoring the Nick Fuentes phenomenon and engaging with him as a figure and a person one-on-one, granting him that legitimacy that his ideas are worth kind of indulging and listening to. I don't think you have to do that. You can still combat them and debunk them and challenge them. And if you want to try to, I've spoken to people who want to reach out to him, do it privately, have him for dinner, do it privately. You have to do it. The second there's an audience watching on display, there's a temptation for mass manipulation that he takes the opportunity to do and has continued to do. So yeah, have him for Shabbos dinner for those of you who want to try doing carrots instead of sticks, offering carrots instead of sticks. Maybe it has an effect. People, some people I've heard say, this guy's going to be a Jewish yeshiva bacher in a few years because he's got the mind of an apikoros, a blasphemer in some ways, where he's intellectually gifted in a particular way, and he can, who knows. I like the fact that Nick is like kind of a Magneto. I use a lot of like film references in this episode, but in the way that Magneto was almost sometimes teaming up with his enemies to fight common enemies, because Nick goes after Tucker and Candace because Nick is actually authentic in his hatred, where they use it as a sort of grift. Anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic tropes are often used by people like a Tucker or Candace opportunistically, in order to sort of provoke the audience, provoke the haters, provoke the lovers, provoke the fans, and keep things going. Nick doesn't quite do that. So in a way, he's authentic. You got to give him that. So we'll keep covering that here on the show as it develops, as it updates. Again, I'll leave you with this. I'm still encouraged. I remain cautiously optimistic because ultimately, so Jordan Peterson has always said, how do you weather these storms? Tell the truth. You tell the truth no matter what. You weather that storm, and then you come out the other end stronger and better for it. Forget when Joe Rogan felt like he was being canceled during the height of COVID when they released an N-word compilation video about him. And he stuck to his guns. He told the truth. He told you what he thought. And he came out the other end bigger and with a larger audience than ever. And so You continually tell the truth and have integrity, it serves you well, and you win in the long run, even if you have short-term losses. If you continually lie, misrepresent, manipulate, lack integrity and credibility, you may get short-term gains, but you will have long-term losses in your entire audience. If that's what you're after, rather than the truth, just become obscure, irrelevant. And that's what I predict will happen. Just have to be patient. It will happen. It is an inevitability. The truth wins, and the liars don't. Thanks for watching, everybody. This has been Ami's House Live. I appreciate everybody tuning in. Subscribe on Patreon. Appreciate all the followers. Just did a show last night in LA where I met a few of you. Patrons came out. Thank you so much for coming out. More shows to be announced, more shows to come. New York, going to be performing also in Houston. I'll be in Atlanta performing with the band, Distant Cousins. Happy Hanukkah, everybody. Happy holidays to everybody else. It's the most wonderful time of the year. This is Ami's House Live. Thanks for watching.